I was finishing a quarterly audit report in our house in Denver when my wife, Olivia Carter, walked into my office dressed like she was heading to a first date and told me I had 30 days to prove I was a husband she deserved. And the way she said it was what unsettled me the most, calm and measured, like she was presenting a strategic adjustment to a long-term investment rather than talking about our 11-year marriage. And I remember staring at the spreadsheet on my screen with its neat rows of risk exposure percentages while realizing that somehow I had become the liability in my own household. I am 42 years old, a senior risk consultant who spends his days identifying threats before they materialize, quantifying uncertainty, building mitigation frameworks. And yet in that moment, I understood that I was being placed on probation inside my own home without any clearly defined criteria for success. She stood in the doorway for a second before stepping in, heels clicking softly on the hardwood, her perfume sharper than usual, and she looked composed, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced a speech in her head. And then she listed her demands in broad corporate language, saying I needed to be more intentional, more romantic, more spontaneous, but also more stable and predictable, as if those qualities were not inherently in tension with one another. And when I asked her what that meant, in practical terms, she tilted her head slightly and gave me a small smirk that felt more like a challenge than an invitation to improve. And she said, if you don't know by now, that's the problem. That sentence landed harder than anything else because it removed the possibility of clarity. It told me that the target would always move, that any attempt I made could be reframed as insufficient, and I felt something tighten in my chest that I had not felt before, not anger exactly, but the cold realization that this was not a collaborative conversation. It was an evaluation with predetermined disappointment. I tried to slow the moment down by asking for examples, asking her to name a situation where I had failed to show up, to describe a specific instance where I had not been romantic enough or intentional enough, but she refused to anchor her critique in anything tangible, and instead she repeated variations of the same abstract phrases, saying she needed to feel chosen, needed to feel excitement, needed to feel security and unpredictability at the same time, and every time I attempted to translate that into something actionable, she dismissed it as me overanalyzing, which is ironic considering analysis is literally how I survive professionally. I looked at her and noticed details that did not align with the gravity of what she was saying, the careful way her hair was styled, the subtle but deliberate makeup, the dress I had not seen before, and it felt less like she was preparing to rebuild something and more like she was preparing for an alternative, like this 30-day ultimatum was not an opportunity, but a formality. I thought about the last decade of early mornings, late nights, promotions earned, stability built, the house we bought in Denver, the vacations planned months in advance because I'm the kind of man who plans, and I wonder when stability had become synonymous with dullness in her mind standing there in my own office, surrounded by reports and certifications that validate my competence in every other arena of life. I realized that competence did not protect me here. That love, apparently, required an entirely different metric system, one she controlled and refused to disclose. I told her I was willing to work on whatever she felt was missing, that I did not view marriage as something you casually renegotiate like a vendor contract. But she only nodded as if she had expected that response, as if this was a test she had already decided I would fail. When she left the room, the silence felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, and I stared at my screen again, the numbers blurring slightly, understanding with unsettling clarity that I had just been handed a 30-day performance review with no rubric, no benchmarks, and no guarantee that success was even possible. Over the next week, she transformed the entire situation into something that felt disturbingly corporate, like I had been enrolled in a performance improvement plan without signing anything, and she began behaving less like a wife and more like a project manager assigned to evaluate my deficiencies, sending me links to long think pieces about men who plan elaborate surprise dates involving private chefs and handwritten letters, forwarding Instagram reels of husbands blindfolding their wives, before revealing candlelit rooftops, and attaching no commentary other than subtle timestamps, as if the implication was self-explanatory, and my failure to replicate those curated moments was a character flaw rather than a stylistic difference. She texted me screenshots of couples' retreats in Aspen that cost $4,800 per weekend, complete with spa packages and guided intimacy workshops. And when I pointed out the absurdity of that expense in the middle of an already demanding fiscal quarter, she responded with a single sentence about how you can't put a price on emotional connection, which conveniently reframed financial responsibility as emotional negligence. At the same time, she began narrating our marriage publicly as if it were undergoing some bold transformation, telling her friends at dinner that we were reinventing our relationship, joking that she had finally put me on a 30-day challenge to prove I was capable of romance, and laughing in that polished way that invited sympathy, without revealing any concrete wrongdoing. I overheard her once on speakerphone describing me as emotionally unavailable and obsessed with spreadsheets, and the way her friends chuckled in agreement stung more than I expected, not because I felt misunderstood, but because she was crafting a version of me that served her storyline, a convenient archetype of the distant analytical husband who needed to be awakened. Simultaneously, small logistical details began to shift in ways that would have been invisible to someone less attuned to patterns. But pattern recognition is literally how I am wired, and I noticed she changed her phone password after years of leaving it face up on the kitchen counter. She started tilting the screen away when texts came in, and she began attending late wellness classes that always seemed to run past 9 p.m., sometimes close to 10, despite the studio's website listing sessions. That ended at 8:15. Her wardrobe subtly adjusted too, more fitted dresses for errands that did not require that level of effort. More perfume on nights she claimed she was decompressing through breathwork and sound baths, and when I mentioned that her schedule seemed unusually fluid, she dismissed it as me being controlling, which was ironic given that I had not once asked her to stop. One evening, after she returned from another extended class with that faintly distant expression I had started recognizing, I asked her directly if it was someone else, and I did not raise my voice or accuse her of anything specific. I simply asked in a neutral tone that left space for honesty, and she paused for a fraction of a second that was just long enough to matter before saying that's not the point, which told me everything I needed to know, without providing a single factual detail. She did not deny it. She did not reassure me. She redirected the conversation back to my supposed emotional shortcomings, as if the presence of another man would merely be a symptom of my failure rather than a separate betrayal. In that moment, I felt something recalibrate internally, not rage and not panic, but clarity. And instead of arguing or escalating, I went quiet. Not the kind of silence designed to punish or manipulate, but the kind born from observation, because arguing with shifting narrative is pointless and defending yourself against undefined accusations is a guaranteed loss. I began watching instead, tracking timelines, noticing inconsistencies, listening more than I spoke. Because if I was going to be evaluated in my own home, I would at least understand the framework being used against me. And the more she performed the role of evaluator, the more obvious it became that this 30-day probation was less about improvement and more about justification. The deadline quickly became her favorite weapon, something she could unsheath casually in the middle of an ordinary evening, as if it were a countdown timer hovering above my head. And she would say things like, "You have 3 weeks left," or "I'm not seeing enough growth," in the same neutral tone someone might use to discuss quarterly sales targets, reducing our marriage to a measurable experiment where she alone defined the metrics and interpreted the results. She began peppering our conversations with subtle reminders of the ticking clock, sometimes glancing at her phone as if calculating remaining days, sometimes sighing dramatically when I failed to perform some undefined romantic gesture she had apparently imagined in advance, and every comment reinforced the idea that I was on borrowed time in my own life. At the same time, her social media presence shifted into something almost theatrical, with carefully curated posts about choosing yourself and not settling for less than you deserve, accompanied by filtered photos of her looking composed and contemplative, and I could see how the narrative was being shaped in real time, how she was positioning herself as a woman courageously demanding better rather than as someone quietly destabilizing a marriage. Her best friend Vanessa Brooks was a constant presence in the comment section, writing things like "know your worth," and if you wanted you would, reinforcing a script where my supposed inadequacy was already assumed and my redemption was conditional upon dramatic displays of pursuit. I realized with clarity that surprised even me that the true audience of my so-called transformation was never me, and it was never even Olivia in private. It was her social circle, a gallery of observers who would validate her strength if I failed and applaud her generosity if I succeeded. The structure it became obvious. She wanted a redemption arc, a storyline where I chased and she evaluated, where I scrambled to win her back, while she maintained a posture of reluctant gatekeeper, and the more I understood that dynamic, the less inclined I was to participate in it. I stopped reacting to the countdown comments. I stopped defending myself against vague accusations, and instead I redirected my energy inward in ways that were quiet but deliberate. I began cooking my own meals without announcing it, preparing simple food for myself in the evenings while she scrolled through her phone, no longer asking what she wanted or trying to coordinate dinner plans around her unpredictable schedule. I resumed a consistent workout routine, lifting in the mornings before work and running on weekends, not as a dramatic display, but as a reassertion of control over something tangible and measurable in my life. I updated my emergency contact information at the office from her to my older brother, without mentioning it, not out of spite but out of practicality, because contingency planning is instinctive for me, and I no longer felt confident that she occupied that role in any meaningful way. Then I quietly began reviewing our joint finances with the same methodical attention I apply to corporate audits, examining account histories, subscription payments, credit card statements, and small irregularities that might have gone unnoticed before. Not because I was searching for ammunition, but because clarity is stabilizing when everything else feels deliberately ambiguous. I did not confront her about anything I found, and I did not alter the way I moved the house. But internally, I was reorganizing my understanding of our situation, accepting that the probation period was less about growth and more about positioning. And that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, can be its own form of strength. One night, she left her phone face up on the kitchen island while she went upstairs to change, and I was standing a few feet away, pouring a glass of water, when the screen lit up a notification banner that I did not have to pick up or unlock to see, a name followed by a short message that said, "Can't wait to see you again." And the name was Ryan, not a co-worker I recognized, not a family member, not anyone she had ever mentioned in casual conversation. The moment stretched in a strange, suspended silence where nothing had technically happened, yet everything had shifted, and before I could even process the full weight of what I had read, she came back down the stairs, saw the screen illuminated, and moved faster than I had seen her move in weeks, snatching the phone off the counter and clutching it to her chest as if I had attempted to steal it. Her immediate reaction was not explanation but accusation, and she told me I had no right to invade her privacy, even though the phone had been in plain sight, and I had not touched it. And a reflexive defensiveness confirmed more than any confession would have. I did not raise my voice, and I did not demand to see the message again, because in that instant I understood something more important than the contents of single text. I understood that the 30-day deadline was not an opportunity for improvement, but a smokescreen, a narrative scaffold designed to justify behavior that had already begun. She wanted freedom without accountability, exploration without consequence, and she wanted the safety of knowing I was still in place as a contingency plan in case whatever she was testing failed to deliver what she imagined. The realization did not produce the dramatic confrontation one might expect. It produced a calm that felt almost clinical, the kind that comes when a hypothesis you've been quietly forming is finally confirmed by data. Instead of arguing about Ryan or parsing the semantics of privacy, I shifted my focus to structural protection, because emotional volatility rarely yields strategic advantage. The next morning, I logged into our joint banking account and reviewed the balances with the same attention I use when auditing corporate exposure, and I transferred my exact portion of our $86,000 joint savings into my personal account, leaving her share intact, but removing the possibility that my stability could be leveraged against me. I did not make a show of it, and I did not inform her immediately, because this was not about punishment. It was about insulation. I then removed her as an authorized user on my primary credit card, updated my online banking credentials, changed every password associated with my email, investment accounts, and professional platforms, enabled two-factor authentication across the board, not because I anticipated sabotage, but because prevention is more effective than reaction. Each small administrative step felt less like retaliation and more like reclaiming autonomy, like drawing a clear boundary in a situation where boundaries have been intentionally blurred. In the evenings, while she continued her late wellness classes and curated posts about self-empowerment, I began quietly browsing listings for short-term apartments downtown, places with month-to-month leases and secure parking, calculating commute times and deposit requirements, running cost comparisons against our current mortgage obligations. I did all of this without theatrics, without ultimatums, and without asking for explanations that would likely be reframed as misunderstandings, because by then I no longer needed verbal confirmation to understand the direction of our marriage. The text from Ryan was not the beginning of something. It was evidence of something already in motion. And as she intended to test her freedom while keeping me anchored as insurance, I had no intention of remaining unsecured. 2 days later, I signed a 6-month lease on a furnished condo 15 minutes away from the house, a modern high-rise unit with neutral walls, a compact balcony, and enough space to function without feeling temporary, and the rent was $2,300 a month, which I calculated down to the dollar against my monthly net income, confirming that it was entirely manageable without touching long-term investments. The decision did not feel impulsive or dramatic. It felt procedural, like executing a contingency plan that had been forming quietly in the background while she curated quotes about self-worth. I transferred the deposit, scheduled the move-in date, and printed the lease agreement with the same steady hands I use when signing client contracts, because clarity eliminates hesitation. When I packed, I did not dismantle a house or empty drawers and theatrical sweep. I selected only what was necessary: 2 tailored suits for client meetings, a week's worth of casual clothes, gym gear, my laptop, personal files, passport, financial documents, and a small box of items that were unquestionably mine, and I placed them into a single suitcase and a carry-on bag with deliberate restraint. I left the rest untouched, not because it held sentimental weight, but because I was not staging an escape. I was establishing distance. Before closing the bedroom door, I removed my wedding ring and set it on the dresser where it would be visible but not dramatic. A quiet acknowledgement that symbolism means nothing when substance has eroded. She saw the suitcase before I'd zipped it fully, and her reaction was immediate. Not sorrow but accusation. And she asked if I was trying to manipulate her, as if the only conceivable reason for a man to create boundaries was strategic pressure. I told her calmly that I was stepping out of the evaluation process, that I did not consent to being measured against undefined criteria under a ticking deadline, and that I would not participate in a system where success was intentionally vague and failure was pre-assigned. She accused me of abandoning the marriage, her voice rising for the first time since this entire experiment had begun, and I responded without raising mine that a marriage is not a performance review with quarterly targets and subjective scoring from a single evaluator. The shift in her composure was visible. The confidence that had fueled her countdown rhetoric faltered, and she moved quickly into solution mode, suggesting therapy with urgency, as if it were a new concept rather than something she had previously dismissed as unnecessary, then pivoting back to the Aspen retreat she had been promoting for weeks, emphasizing how transformative it could be, how we could reconnect away from distractions, how it would demonstrate commitment. The proposals came rapid fire and emotionally charged, but what remained consistent was that each solution preserved her authorship of the narrative, positioned her as the gatekeeper of reconciliation, and required me to re-enter the very structure I had just declined. I listened without interrupting and without engaging the emotional cadence she was attempting to establish, because beneath the words the dynamic was unchanged. She still framed the marriage as something I needed to repair to meet her threshold, and every suggestion maintained her control over timing, optics, and interpretation. I told her I was not closing the door permanently, and I was not issuing threats, but I was removing myself from a framework that reduced our relationship to a probationary contract, and until the conversation shifted from evaluation to accountability on both sides, distance was the only stable position available to me. After I moved out, her tone changed with speed that would have been impressive if it had not been so transparent, and within hours of me settling into the condo, she began sending messages that sounded nothing like the composed evaluator who had been tracking my growth against an invisible rubric. She texted that she missed us, not me specifically, but us, as if the concept of our shared life had suddenly become fragile in my absence, and she insisted that I was overreacting, that the deadline had never been meant literally, that it was only a way to spark urgency and shake us out of complacency. The language softened, the edges rounded, and the confidence that had defined her countdown rhetoric dissolved into something close to concern, but the timing of it revealed more than the words themselves. At the same time, information began reaching me from directions she likely had not anticipated, mutual friends who were not invested in her narrative quietly informing me that she had already been seeing Ryan for at least 2 months before the ultimatum was ever delivered, which reframed the entire 30-day probation as retroactive justification rather than a genuine attempt at repair. The sequence of events aligned too neatly to ignore, the sudden emphasis on my deficiencies, the public storytelling about reinvention, the carefully curated independence, all unfolding while she was already exploring an alternative. The deadline had not been a chance for me to improve. It had been a transitional buffer, a way to test something new while keeping me positioned as insurance. What she expected, I realized, was resistance in the form of pursuit, a dramatic refusal to let her drift, emotional speeches, promises, visible competition with a man whose existence she had refused to acknowledge directly. She anticipated that I would fight for the role she had already started reallocating, that I would beg, negotiate, and attempt to outperform someone who had been inserted into the equation quietly. Instead, I redirected my energy towards stabilizing my own life without theatrics, and the absence of chaos seemed to unsettle her more than confrontation would have. I focused on my work with an intensity that felt grounding rather than escapist, taking on a complex risk assessment project that required long hours and precise modeling, and the structure of it provided a clarity that my personal life had lacked for months. I started training for a half marathon, mapping out a 12-week program with incremental mileage increases, early morning runs along the river replacing evenings of tense silence in the house we once shared. The physical strain was honest and measurable, my progress defined by pace and distance rather than subjective approval, and each completed run reinforced a sense of agency that had been slowly eroded under the weight of evaluation. I reconnected with old friends I had allowed to drift during the years of routine, meeting for coffee without the underlying tension and narrative being managed in the background. And within weeks I noticed something subtle but undeniable, a lightness that was not dramatic euphoria, but the absence of constant self-monitoring. The silence I gave her was not designed to punish or manipulate. It was not a tactic to provoke a reaction. It was detachment born from clarity, the decision to stop performing for an audience that had already decided the script. About a month later, she asked to meet at a cafe in Boulder to talk, and I agreed because by then I was no longer afraid of conversation. I was simply curious which version of the narrative she intended to present in person. The cafe was one of those quiet, minimalist places with exposed brick walls and large windows overlooking the foothills, and she was already seated when I arrived, hands wrapped around a coffee she had barely touched, her posture smaller than I remembered. She started with nostalgia, referencing trips we had taken years ago, the early days in our first apartment, the way we used to stay up late planning our future, and then the tears came, controlled but visible, enough to signal vulnerability, without dissolving her composure entirely. She said she felt lost and confused, that somewhere along the way she stopped recognizing herself inside our routine, and she framed the deadline as a wake-up call for both of us, insisting it had never been about punishment but about shaking us out of stagnation. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I had already processed the emotional terrain she was describing, and I was no longer reactive to it. When she paused, I asked her directly if she had been involved with Ryan before giving me the ultimatum, and the question hung between us longer than it should have. She did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was not subtle. It was measurable, a visible recalibration as she weighed honesty against narrative control, and the silence confirmed more than any elaborate explanation could have. Eventually, she admitted they had been talking and seeing each other before the deadline, though she attempted to soften it with language about emotional connection and uncertainty, and then she delivered the sentence that erased any residual ambiguity I had left, saying she needed to explore her options to know what she truly wanted. The phrasing was almost clinical in its detachment, as if marriage were a marketplace, and I had been one of several viable investments under review. In that moment, I felt no surge of anger, only a final alignment of facts that had already been assembling quietly for weeks, and the remaining space for doubt collapsed completely. I told her calmly that I was filing for separation, and that I would let the attorneys handle the logistics, because at that point the structure of our relationship had already been compromised beyond personal negotiation. She reacted quickly, the tears intensifying, and accused me of giving up too easily, of walking away instead of fighting for what we built, and she said I would regret being so rigid. I let her finish before responding, because what she described as rigidity I recognized as self-preservation, and I told her I was not giving up, I was opting out of being a backup plan. I explained that a partnership cannot survive when one person reserves the right to explore alternatives while expecting the other to remain stationary and loyal, and that her need to test options had already answered the question of commitment. The conversation did not escalate into shouting or dramatics. It ended with a quiet finality that felt heavier than anger would have, and when I stood to leave, I realized that the sense of lightness I had been feeling over the past weeks was not temporary relief, but the result of clarity, the kind that makes difficult decisions feel less like losses and more like necessary exits. 3 months later, I finalized the paperwork, signed the last set of documents in a quiet conference room with my attorney while the city moved on outside as if nothing monumental had shifted. And when the clerk stamped the forms, it did not feel dramatic or devastating. It felt procedural, like closing a file that had been under review for far too long. There was no surge of triumph and no collapse into grief. Only a steady recognition that the uncertainty phase had ended and clarity had solidified into something official. The house was sold without conflict, assets divided cleanly according to what we had already separated months earlier, and the legal process moved with the efficiency that emotional processes rarely possess. Not long after everything was finalized, I heard through mutual friends that she and Ryan had broken up, and the explanation was almost anticlimactic. He did not want anything serious. He had enjoyed the attention and the novelty, but had no intention of replacing a structured marriage with commitment of his own. The symmetry of it was almost clinical. She had risked stability to explore, and the exploration had come with no guarantees attached. I did not feel vindicated when I heard it, because by then her choices were no longer tethered to my sense of self. They were simply data points in a life I was no longer participating in. She sent one last message weeks after separation was finalized, a short paragraph that attempted to compress months of tension into a single reflection, saying she thought I would fight harder for her, that she never expected me to walk away so decisively, that somewhere deep down she believed I would compete, persist, insist. I read the message once and then again more slowly, not searching for hidden meaning, but observing consistent thread running through it, the assumption that love is proven to pursuit even when the ground rules are stacked unevenly. I never responded, not out of spite and not as a calculated silence designed to wound, but because there was nothing left to clarify. The truth had become simple in a way that required no additional commentary. She gave me 30 days to become the man she required, framing growth as compliance with her undefined expectations. But in less than 30 hours, I became someone who no longer required her approval to feel complete. The shift was not about ego or retaliation. It was about refusing to audition for a role that should have been rooted in mutual respect. I stopped trying to decode fluctuating standards and instead reinforced my own. And once respect becomes non-negotiable, you stop offering discounts on your own dignity, even to someone you once promised forever. Looking back, the probation period she designed did not transform me into a better husband under her supervision. It clarified that my worth was never meant to be negotiated in the first place. I did not win her back. I did not compete for position, and I did not accept a framework that reduced partnership to performance metrics. I fought, but not in the way she anticipated, not through dramatic declarations or emotional bargaining. I fought by stepping out of structure that diminished me and by choosing stability over spectacle. And in the quiet that followed, without countdowns or curated narratives, I found something far more sustainable than approval. I found self-respect that did not fluctuate with someone else's evaluation.